Welcome, Patrick Macqueen, real estate attorney extraordinaire. Thank you so much for coming back and really just addressing this question. I had a real estate agent reach out and I was like, I don't know the answer, but I know somebody that might. So, Patrick, welcome.
Well, thank you. I'm happy to be here.
So the question is regarding squatters. And so the real estate agent had a transaction, and prior to the owners moving in, apparently squatters came and squatted in the house. Now this was Texas, not in Arizona. I realize that you do business in Arizona, but just kind of like on a high level, it got me thinking, what does one do if, you're in that situation where maybe you've bought a property and then a person that has no ownership interest or any party to anybody involved, the seller, the buyer, etc., decides to move into the house? What happens?
You go ballistic.
Okay, great. I'll make that note.
Exactly. Just check the box that you went ballistic. No, I would go nuts if that happened to me. Hey, I just bought my dream house, or hey, I bought this house and I spent a bunch of money and I wanted to move in, and it's the holidays or whatever. I want to, and now there's someone hanging out in my kitchen. It happens, and it unfortunately happens more often than people know about. Yeah. And so, if there is a squatter, you have to ensure you likely have to go through the entire eviction process. Oh. And that is a pain in the butt. That can take up to 20, 30 days here in Arizona. And guess what? You're still without your house that you just bought for 20 or 30 days. So usually, if the police aren't willing to do anything, well, then you've got to go through the eviction process. And sometimes if the squatter says, well, hey, the prior owner said I could just hang out here for the next couple of months. And it's like, now we've got a real issue, because does this person truly have an interest in staying here, the legal right to stay here? And sometimes what I've seen these turn into are actual quiet title lawsuits. So for instance, if I go in and I've got a deed to my house now, and someone's hanging out in my new house and they claim an interest, hey, I had the right to be here based on this lease agreement. Hey, I had the right to be here because I've been hanging out here for the last 5, 6, 7 years. Happens all the time. Well, now we've got a claim that they may have an adverse possession right to stay there. Now we have to go through an entire lawsuit to quiet title. And guess who is target number one after I go through this process to pay back my attorney's fees and to pay my, not pain and suffering, but just, exhaustion and having to deal with this.
Yeah.
It's who didn't tell me about this. So it happens a lot, and you're probably going to have to file some sort of court action to have them removed, which is crazy to think.
Oh my gosh. Well, what do people do to prevent this from happening? So I understand if there was kind of a situation with a seller and, maybe a relative hung out, maybe the seller didn't occupy and that type of thing. But what if it's not that? What if it's just, there is somebody that realizes the house is vacant and the for sale sign's out front, and, they decide to move in because they've monitored the property and realized that people maybe aren't visiting, et cetera. So they move in. In that scenario, I mean, they still potentially, if the police won't do anything, then there's still a process that the new buyer is going to have to go through to essentially evict that person. Yeah. But what can people do to maybe prevent this from happening? Are there any tips or thoughts you have on that?
If you're coming from out of state, I would strongly urge you to have your buyer's agent, the agent that helped you out, do some sort of pre-closing inspection, pre-closing walkthrough, just to make sure that, the risk of this happening is pretty low. I mean, I would say it probably happens 1 out of 2,000, 5,000 times. So it's very, very low. But if you're coming from out of state, and maybe the seller was out of state as well, this was their second home, et cetera, and you do have somebody who's kind of lingering around hoping that nobody catches on to what's going on, yeah, some sort of pre-closing inspection would be a great idea.
Yeah. Well, in this real estate agent's question, that's exactly what was happening. She was doing the walkthrough on the pre-closing inspection, and then this person was there, and then this property was in Texas. So I guess apparently in Texas they have a whole protection of rights, and it turned into a nightmare. The buyers couldn't occupy the home. They couldn't just get rid of the squatter. So it was a big deal. And I don't know what Arizona's policy is on that, but I mean, I know Arizona's got pretty strict tenant laws. So that on some level, I guess you have to get into, is that person legally a tenant, et cetera. It just sounds like a nightmare. I think the other thing too, I would be thinking of is just, does the seller have some type of security system? Do they have video? I think now with, all of the different technologies that are out there, if the seller isn't in Arizona, are they monitoring it, making sure that their real estate agent that's representing them is also engaged just on the possibility? And I think the sooner they can detect somebody that has maybe entered the property, getting the police there to try to exit, it's almost kind of maybe like a breaking and entering, as opposed to if they're there for weeks, it probably becomes and looks like something else. I don't know. I'm just guesstimating. I'm spitballing here.
No, I think you're exactly right. I think that's a great idea. If the seller's willing to do something like that, I think that's huge. But yeah, otherwise you're gonna have to follow landlord-tenant laws. And while landlord-tenant laws in Arizona, anyways, largely favor landlords and are a little bit more beneficial to landlords, you've still got a process to go through to prove that this person has no right to be there. And that's a process, and that's a pain in the tail. And you don't want to have to go through that if you can avoid it at all costs. What we sometimes have, this is a little bit of a side note, but what we've been dealing with sometimes are hotels where they can't get guests to leave. And it's been this sort of phenomenon since COVID, actually. So what we've had are people who've been living and they've been largely paying their hotel fees, but for the last 2 or 3 years, now they've established that they're going to continue to stay there and they're paying. Well, how do you actually get rid of a hotel guest? Are they a tenant? Or if you don't want them there because they're a day or two late, can you call the police and lock them out? And it's some interesting analysis, and that's happening in many, many different states. So in addition to it happening in the residential real estate world here in Arizona and in Texas, it's happening in the hotel world too. Normally, if it's a day or two type of thing on a hotel side, you call the police and you lock them out. But if they've been staying there for the last month or two, well, now they've got this argument and they're emboldened that says, hey, I've got tenants' rights and you have to go through the eviction process, which means I get to stay in this hotel for another 20 or 30 days. It's wild. And so it's happening. And so, the way you protect yourself on the residential side is certainly some monitoring, certainly a pre-closing inspection. The seller's got an obligation to deliver the property without occupants. And so if you have to delay closing, if the seller has to pay extra costs to deal with this, then that's something they have to do because they failed to monitor in the first place.
Yeah. And I think that is such an important piece of, we think about the sequence. So if the buyer has not closed escrow yet, even though maybe they're moving here and they've got to have a place and the kids start school and all the things that go along with relocations, I think that they should get legal advice about maybe not closing and doing exactly what you said. Now put it back on the seller and let the seller expend the cost and the police and go through all of the hassle of being able to deliver the property, because once the buyer owns it, now it becomes their problem, right?
Yeah, you really lose a lot of arguments that, hey, we shouldn't have closed. If you close, you close. And now it's largely your problem. And so, this situation where you ought to issue the cure notice, go through that process if you're an agent.
Yeah. Well, Patrick, you're always so full of intel, great insights, etc. I really appreciate you, and I appreciate you taking time out to come in and share all that you know with us. If you have a real estate related issue and you need a great real estate attorney, I have included Patrick's information below. Feel free to reach out.